Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Wednesday, April 15th, 2026, Tax Day. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. And in today's episode, given that it is Tax Day, we're also excited about that. We have Jason Mercier, Vice President and Director for Research with Mountain States Policy Center, with some thoughts on income taxes. Of course, we have one in Washington now. You knew that, right? So a short history lesson from him on how the federal government has managed to expand that income tax. It began over 100, well, it was 113 years ago. Yeah, so it was 1913. At that time, just like we're told here in Washington, it was going to be a very limited, small tax and only on the wealthy. It won't expand to all of us. So, shall we put faith that that's going to be the case here in Washington with our new income tax? Then a conversation with a courageous young woman who really has led the national detransition movement. Her name is Prisha Mosley, still fighting to hold the medical professionals accountable who convinced her, starting when she was just 17 years old, that she was in fact, in the wrong body. And that's when she began her chemical and surgical transition. She is fighting in North Carolina now the statute of limitations. You may recall there was a pretty significant decision in North Carolina in the middle of 2025 that said we're going to extend the statute of limitations specifically because a lot of these young people undergoing these pretty dramatic surgeries, mutilating their bodies when they're still juveniles, then they get, 5, 7, 10 years down the road and go, what did I do to myself? And they want to be able to hold those medical professionals accountable. So she's appealed that case. There were arguments that took place in court this week on that. So a very interesting conversation with Prisha, who is so courageous to share her very personal story and what she has been through, what she's still going through, and why she's kept up this fight all these years, despite what it has cost her, in her own life. And then my colleagues TJ Martinell and Tim Clauser break down the many millions of dollars spent by the Washington Attorney General's office just to sue Donald Trump. Countless hours at taxpayer expense. So let's dive in. It is tax day. It's April 15th, the 113th year since the first income tax became law by our federal government. That was back in 1913. That started at 1% for incomes above certain thresholds. So it only applied to a very small number of people. And you know the rest of the script. It didn't quite stay there because you probably, like me, pay your federal income taxes every year, or if you get behind, you do them 2 or 3 years at a time. But here's Jason Mercier with Mountain States Policy Center with a bit of history about our federal income tax.
And so, see if these arguments sound familiar. We're going to impose a limited tax that's only going to impact about 2% of the population. It's going to be on millionaires, and you don't have to worry about this tax because you'll never pay it. Well, unfortunately, all of us today on April 15th owe federal income tax. Yeah, that was the exact promise made when Congress imposed the income tax back in 1913. After the 16th Amendment was ratified, Congress quickly followed up with what they called a millionaire's tax. It was estimated to only hit 2% of the population. Its rates ran between 1 to 7%. You fast forward to 2027, and this just proves what happens with income taxes. The rates increase, the brackets expand. So this limited millionaires tax passed in 1913, now all of us are subject to, and I would love a 7% rate, but the rates now are 10% to 37%. And this is probably the future that Washington is looking at if the Supreme Court doesn't do what every other court before it has done and strike down income taxes that don't conform with the property restrictions.
Now, when Governor Bob Ferguson signed SB 6346, our new millionaires tax, signed that into law just over 2 weeks ago, he was touting the benefits to the average Washingtonian who will get some money back. They're doing a pretty dramatic expansion of the working families tax credit as part of this redistribution of wealth. So here's what he said on the bill signing day.
Since I first announced my support for millionaires tax back in December, I made it clear that a substantial portion of these dollars must go back in the pockets of hardworking Washingtonians, small businesses, working families, to make life more affordable for them. What we do with this revenue matters. In the first full year of this revenue, when it comes in, more than 40% of the revenue will go directly back to Washingtonians. Let me give you 5 examples. Number 1, we expanded a wonderful program that we have in Washington State, thanks to our state legislature, the Working Families Tax Credit. Yeah. Fantastic program. This program, by the way, other states are starting to model this program, by the way. They see the success of this. This literally sends a check back to hardworking Washingtonians in the form of a check between $300 and $1,300, depending on the size of their family and their income. It's a great program. We just need to expand it. And with the revenue from the millionaires tax, we're adding 460,000 working families who receive that tax credit every single year. Number 2, funding for free breakfast and lunch for every K through 12 student in Washington State. This puts money back in the pockets of families and helps make sure that kids are ready to learn. Guess what? It's tough to learn on a hungry stomach, right? Yeah. This will help those kids all across our state. It's been a priority of mine since I ran for governor. I talked about my first stay of the state. It was the first bill I proposed as governor. And I just want to also recognize 2 folks who have been very involved in this legislation, this effort for a long time. State Senator Marcus Riccelli and State Representative April Berg. Give them a huge round of applause.
Now, critics, including many representatives of the small business community and their advocates, say it's really going to be more of a hit than a benefit to small business because of the way they structure their business and taxes. Most of them operate as pass-through entities. So business income is reported as personal income on federal taxes. So it might show that, your business brought in $1.3 million that year. That shows as personal income. Well, in fact, it's not that. Most of the time, that is going to be used for business reinvestment, potentially expanding business, hiring new employees, buying new equipment. So there's a big concern in the small business community about really there will be some B&O tax offset benefit here, but will it be enough to offset, the many numbers of folks who are concerned this is going to impact them? So again, Jason Mercier with Mountain States Policy Center believes the tax is unconstitutional. He believes it's eventually going to trickle down to each and every one of us. But he calls it pretty alarming that supporters, including the governor, know they've got all this court precedence that goes against an income tax. And the state constitution very clearly says that our income is our property.
This is the first time that the legislature and the governor have willfully and openly defied Supreme Court rulings to impose a tax on income. And how they expect the results to be differently is beyond me. I mean, you're basically asking 5 Supreme Court justices of the 9 to say that Washingtonians don't own their income. Can that happen? It's possible. That's a pretty bold move for an elected Supreme Court justice to overturn 100 years of rulings and say, you know what, Washingtonians, we were just kidding. You don't, in fact, own your income.
Mercier did tell me that he does not hold out much hope that Let's Go Washington and founder Brian Haywood's attempt to get the state Supreme Court to allow a referendum on the income tax to proceed. He doesn't think it's going to be successful. He said that he bases that on the fact that the state Supreme Court has previously granted some pretty broad discretion for lawmakers to attach emergency clauses to legislation and have said in those prior rulings that, it's not our job to determine what's necessarily a budgetary emergency. That's what lawmakers are tasked with doing. And so he does not think that the challenge is going to be successful for a referendum, although Let's Go Washington has indicated to me that the plan is probably going to be for dual initiatives to the ballot this year, maybe one directly to the people and one that would go to the legislature. Again, that's going to take some time. It's going to take quite a bit of effort to get more than maybe 400,000 signatures, I think is what they would want to get on each of those. In order to, you're going to have some of those signatures that get tossed out by the Secretary of State. They're duplicative or whatever. So there's, still a lot of things that could potentially undo this income tax. We shall see. April 30th, by the way, set for those arguments of the state Supreme Court for Haywood's case on the referendum, if I forgot to mention that to you. And we'll certainly be in the courtroom and excited to bring you that update when it happens. Now, a woman is waiting to find out if a North Carolina appeals court is going to let her case proceed as she seeks to reinstate medical malpractice claims that could really dramatically change accountability standards in gender medicine. She is independent women ambassador and detransitioner Prisha Mosley. She's 28 now. She sued her healthcare providers initially back in 2023. These medical providers and therapists started encouraging her gender transition when she was just 17 years old. Her case ended up getting dismissed on a procedural basis because North Carolina had a statute of limitations that expired. Well, things have changed now in North Carolina. So she's got this appeal going, hoping that in fact she can reinstate those medical malpractice claims. Obviously, born a female, was making the transition to be a male, regretted it almost immediately, and has really, lifelong physical and mental injuries as a result of that. So I want to share part of my conversation that I had with her. I find her to be most inspiring and so courageous because I can't imagine discussing something more personal and more vulnerable than what this woman has been through. And going back to when she was a child, and had suffered her own trauma that kind of set her on this course.
So I had difficulty, trauma, and sexual trauma going on when I was a child. I was sexually assaulted and became pregnant when I was 14 and miscarried. And this happened right after I started my period, which, made me connect the whole thing to like being a woman. So when I was online on Tumblr in specific, and trans identifying adults started telling me that my suffering was because I was trans and that this stuff wouldn't happen to me if I was a boy, and that's what I just needed to do. I believed them. I felt validated and not alone instead of telling me that my desire to hurt myself or change myself or be someone else was not healthy. I was told that I was in fact not crazy and that how I felt made sense and that I just needed these drugs and surgery. And when I brought this to my doctors, they essentially said the same thing as the online activists. They didn't give me any pushback or anything. And it was strange because I was already being treated for an eating disorder, anorexia. And they did not tell me that my body was fat and that I really needed to starve myself to be okay. But when I said that I really needed to have a boy body because I was born wrong, they agreed with me.
So she shared with me that after posting videos of her transition after some of these surgeries, including the removal of her breasts, some folks that were kind of pushing back on this gender ideology um, reached out to her, and she partnered up with a group called Partners for Ethical Care. And she started learning that there were others just like her. She wasn't losing her mind. She was fully regretting what she had gone through. And, the mutilation of her body in the name of gender affirming care. And so she has decided to be very public. She was the first of the detransition lawsuits filed. Many others have since joined, and some have been settled. Even more recently, there was a case out of New York, a $2 million verdict for a girl who also underwent a double mastectomy at the age of 16. And her mother ended up testifying in that case, saying, I signed off on this for my daughter. Of course, I fully regret it, but I was told by counselors that she was talking with, that she was trapped in the wrong body. And if I didn't allow her to go on and have these, procedures, she was likely to kill herself. So imagine that dilemma for a parent to go through. And that's some of, what's been happening as these court cases play out. But that ruling in that New York case recently, which was earlier this year, January 30th, is likely to play into many of these other detransitioner medical malpractice lawsuits that are moving forward. Here's another segment of my conversation with Prisha Mosley, talking about the journey that she has been on and it really taking a toll, but being worth the fight.
It's advertisements because they're selling a lie and a scam. I thought that I was having the magical surgery that turned my girl chest into a boy chest because that's what was sold to me. But then I went on to have these very female complications when I gave birth, which also only a female can do. And it's all just a lie. That's why I originally had a merit for fraud because I didn't turn into a boy. But they're like selling things. They don't tell you that you're getting like a double mastectomy and possibly leaving in breast tissues and grafting your nipples and taking everything apart. They don't tell you that. They say we're going to make you a boy. Any doctor, adult, activist who promises to have a quick and magical cure to suffering is selling a scam. There is no magical, easy way to go through puberty or your parents' divorce or other children bullying you or disliking your body. There's no magical cure for that. Every adult who is lying to you and trying to sell you a cure out of these feelings through drugs and surgery got to grow up and experience them and get past them. It's part of growing up and becoming an adult to face these trials and become a whole person. And by stopping those things with chemicals and surgery, they're ultimately taking something away from you that they got to have themselves while making profit. And it's not fair. You deserve better than that.
If she ends up being ultimately successful in this appeal, and again, the appeals court in North Carolina heard those arguments on Monday, but no ruling as yet. If she is successful, this could really set a national precedent in the case, um, you know, making it so that detransitioners like her aren't barred from seeking justice simply because it took some time to fully grasp, their injuries and the extent of the side effects from the chemical and surgical procedures. And it's going to be fascinating to watch this move forward. And in fact, these folks are really buoyed, as I mentioned, by that New York case. So um, watch for updates on that for certain. Now, the Washington State Attorney General's office has billed, get this. Well, actually, I'm not even going to tell you. I'm going to tease you. Let's just say it's tens of thousands of hours, taxpayer billed hours, not to protect the rights of folks here in Washington, not to make sure that we're protected and our rights are upheld, but to go after the Trump administration. Now, some folks that don't support the president might say, "Well, that's great. That's a great use of my taxpayer dollars." But you might be shocked to find out just how many hours we're talking about here, how much time has been spent, and maybe that explains why they needed to hire so many more lawyers in the office of the state attorney general. So here are my colleagues, TJ Martin now and Tim Clauser, to break that down for you.
Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clauser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martineau. Here to talk about the Washington State Attorney General's office billing more than 34,000 hours worth of time towards lawsuits that the state has filed against the Trump administration. TJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about this and what that time adds up to?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that stand out. One, these 34,000 hours represent almost 4 years worth of billable work, and the two-thirds of these hours were billed within a 6-month period. So what we saw was a ramping up of billable hours. And something else to keep in mind is that these are billable hours only with the Attorney General's office staff. This is not for outside counsel or outside law firms. So the total number of hours, billed hours spent on litigation against Donald Trump during his second term could be much, much, much higher. We just don't know because we're going to try and find that out, but we just don't know how many more hours the outside law firms are. We do know that the Attorney General's office, as of last August, has a massive number of contracts with outside law firms, more than 1,000. And so the question is how many of those contracts have to do with Donald Trump?
You say 4 years. That's quite a bit of time. I mean, the Trump administration has been in office for the second term since January 2025. We're almost a year and a half into this, and they've built 4 years worth of work. That's like me sitting down at this desk and working for 4 years nonstop. How many attorneys are we talking about? Is this one attorney? Is this hundreds of attorneys?
Yeah, I mean so there was one estimate by uh, someone from Jackson Boehner from the Citizen Action Defense Fund. He estimated that there had to have been 100 lawyers or the equivalent. The Attorney General's office said that there's only 30 attorneys, but then the question is, well, how many of those billable hours were staff, like non legal staff, paralegals, people who are actually not attorneys? And that's, I think, what's adding to the complication of they don't know how much this costs taxpayers to do these litigation because they can't just use or assume a flat rate. They have to use they would have to use different rates depending on which attorney, how many years of experience they have, whether it's a paralegal. They all are getting different, they're getting paid differently depending on the hours. So that's the issue that's going on. So when they say that there's 30 attorneys, I don't think it's just 30 attorneys working on this. I'm sure that there's also other staff that are helping out. But I think that what that could indicate, we don't know. I'm just saying it could indicate that there's a lot of support staff for a handful of attorneys that are dealing with this.
Mhm. Just some quick math for those listening. I mean, 34,000 hours, assuming there is roughly 30 attorneys working on that, that comes out to about 1,133 hours per attorney. Now, if we break that down to days, that's over 47 days straight of working on these cases. I mean, that's a considerable amount of time, regardless of whether it's the Trump administration or any other lawsuits. What is this costing the taxpayer?
I mean, that's the problem. We don't know how much it's costing taxpayers. It's definitely going to have to be in the millions of dollars. If we've used any kind of conservative estimate, but we just don't know. I think what's going to be interesting is to see how much of this work has been the attorney side is with outside counsel or outside law firms who are involved in these lawsuits. So that's where it could get very interesting to see who they've tasked with overseeing these lawsuits. And something to keep in mind also is that these lawsuits, a vast majority of them concern federal funding or federal policies around federal
Mhm.
funding of some type or another, grants or something like that. So the, I'm sure for people who are, would defend this would say that the money spent doesn't compare to the amount of money that they've been able to preserve in federal funding on for right now. A lot of these cases haven't been settled, but they have gotten temporary um, they've managed to temporarily stop Trump from cutting spending in certain areas. So that would be the argument I imagine people would say on that side of it.
Mhm, and, how many lawsuits are we talking? I know, Ferguson, when he was on the campaign trail running for governor, he brought up the number 50 to 60 lawsuits that he had filed, and during the Trump administration's first term, we're over a year into his second term, and I believe, Ferguson's successor, Attorney General Nick Brown, has he not filed just as many, if not more, in this shorter amount of time?
Yeah, that's I think what is really why I think that this story is noteworthy. The hours are noteworthy and worth reporting on is it represents a massive increase and ramping up of litigation against Trump during his second term. I don't believe Ferguson filed his first lawsuit until I think 8 months or 9 months into Donald Trump's first year during his first term. And so whereas Nick Brown in his office and Ferguson, when he got elected governor, was very open about how they'd been working on preparation to litigate against Trump before he was even elected. So
Mhm.
this represents I'd say pre-planned coordination on just they assumed he would do certain things. They had the legal work and the legal preparation done, and then they would file the lawsuit against him or whatever it was that they're trying to obtain. And so I think that the question is why w what made it different the second time around? Were they just more prepared? Were they not expect? Because I a lot of people didn't think that Donald Trump was gonna get elected in 2016, so there wasn't as much prep work. A lot of people thought even, who didn't vote for Hillary Clinton thought it was in the can for her. So maybe that caught people off guard, during the first term initially, but whereas with the second term, before he's even elected, there's this presumption that if he is, here's stuff he's going to do, and this is legal work that they're going to work on. Because a lot of these hours, when I was looking at what it was spent on, a lot of it was on pre-litigation investigative work. So there was, research or whatever it was. So there was a lot of preparation work before any of a lot of these lawsuits were filed.
And we know that when Ferguson was still Attorney General just a few years ago, he oversaw a pretty substantial expansion of the Attorney General's office. I believe they
Right.
hired hundreds of additional attorneys. I mean, what would this situation look like without that expansion? Do we have any numbers on that? Is it safe to say that that expansion is allowing them to put this much work into the lawsuits against the
Um,
Trump administration?
I think it would really depend on what type of attorneys or staff that they hired, because some of them may have been focused only on certain, because there's different divisions of the attorney general's office. So they may have it depends on who he hired, because they may not have anything to do with this litigation, or it wouldn't even apply to them. If you're hired somebody for the fraud division, probably not going to apply to a whole lot of these situations. This doesn't have to do with fraud. This has to do with whether or not the president or the executive branch uh, has discretion over federal funding, coming through federal agencies. So, but yeah, I mean, if it hadn't expanded as much, you do have to wonder if some staff that would be focused on this litigation would be focused on other things because they just don't have the numbers, or if they would be filing a lot of these litigation at all. Maybe they would just focus on ones where they knew that they were guaranteed to win or very likely to win, because so far, overall, there's been hundreds of lawsuits filed against his administration by different state attorney general's offices. And so far, the administration has won, I believe, 30, and then 19, the plaintiffs have won. So, so far, the one cases that have been closed have been in the administration's favor.
Mhm. And we know filing lawsuits, going through this lengthy legal battles, is quite expensive. If we were to file a lawsuit, those costs would fall on us individually, or the company if we're filing as a company. But in the case of the state, I mean, those costs fall on the taxpayers. And I understand you brought up the argument that, we're talking about billions of dollars in federal funding that the state is suing over. So there's the argument that, what we might get in return for these lawsuits is much more than what we might be spending now. But at the same time, in both cases, it's our tax dollars being spent. Now, what are the tax dollars that they're trying to preserve for these programs? Is it for stuff like SNAP? Is it housing? Is
Yeah,
it some of this more DEI funding?
yeah, it's for a variety of different things. A lot of this stuff I didn't even know existed, like the federal emergency, FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. A lot of acronyms going on. One had to do with a program called Personal Responsibility Education, which has to do with teen reproductive and sexual health education. And some of them just have to do with policies related to qualifying for this funding from at the state level. So it just has a lot to do with money that has been. I think that this is where a critic might find it ironic that there's some of the lawsuits has had to do with state autonomy, states' rights, and yet a lot of these lawsuits has to do with ensuring that states have continual access to federal funding, that they've had prior. So it's interesting that there's some lawsuits that are intended to protect what is seen as state autonomy and overreach, against overreach by the federal government. On the other hand, they're telling the federal government what they can and can't do with their own money, or saying like, you got to keep giving us the money, and can't put any restrictions on certain things. So it's definitely been interesting to see how this is really turned into a form of legal lawfare, where a lot of
Mhm.
states are fighting the federal government, in the courtroom. And this is probably, I mean, it would be interesting to see how many lawsuits have been filed against presidents prior to, say, President Trump, how many lawsuits were
Hmm.
filed against the Obama administration, how many lawsuits were filed against the Bush administration, Clinton administration, and how does that compare? And what does that say about how a lot of things are being settled legally in the United States? Because, if it wasn't settled through a lawsuit back in the day, how was it settled?
Hmm. Well, yeah, the political landscape has changed substantially over the last few decades, especially since Trump joined the White House in 2016, 2017, through Biden and now to today. Much different, wildly different political agendas from DC to Olympia and Washington State right now. But TJ, we appreciate you covering this. And for anyone hoping to read that story, you can get it at thecentersquare.com. But otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.
So that's it for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. Again, for this Wednesday, April 15th. Happy Tax Day. You're probably scrambling if you haven't gotten your taxes done, or maybe you're getting a refund and you don't have to scramble so much. That's good for you. I hope you are getting some money back. Enjoy the rest of your day. And as always, thanks for watching, and check out our Center Square Washington page for more stories just like this.